Well, church, welcome to our fourth and final week of Through the Storm as we've been journeying through the book of Job together. And as we close things off today, I want to begin by sharing a personal entry I wrote into a journal just a short while ago. I fundamentally believe in hope. It is the very foundation of my faith. But there are certain times when it feels elusive and so difficult to grasp onto. Today, we grieve the loss of a precious life to a long struggle with addictions, a young life, a mother of 4, a sister and a daughter, a life that had known far too much struggle, grief, and trauma. The devastation and sadness feels inescapable, unfair, and almost untraceable to its origins. Exactly 1 week ago, we buried another young life lost to the sinister illness of addiction, overdose. He was a son, an uncle, and a beloved nephew. As I stood over the grave with a small gathering of family, tragedy took on a personality. The sobs were deep, revealing gaping holes in what felt like so much life that was left undiscovered and hidden. And these two stories, as raw and as recent as they are, do not feel as isolated as they should. They share too much company and familiarity with other griefs that we have journeyed through as of late. Every week as a nation, we track the losses and impact of an infection that is sweeping through our world, and there are many tragic stories to share, and that impact is real. And yet underneath these, there are the hidden stories that we don't see, that are not shared on graphs or charts, lives that struggle in isolation, disconnected from our world that has been hiding inside, grief that suffers alone without the ability to embrace or to be present with each other, and it all feels so unfair and so unhuman. There are days when hope seems so easy to find, almost inescapable as it breathes life into our souls, but there are days like today when it feels like all you can do is keep your hands sprawled out in front of you in the darkness, hoping to find a switch to turn the light back on. I know it's there. I'll never stop looking for it. I just wish it was easier to find right now. Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you utterly forget me? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I harbor sorrow in my soul, grief in my heart day after day? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Well, I suppose I choose to share these words as a backdrop for the closing of our journey through the book of Job together, because much of what I think we discover in this book was the gut-level honesty of Job and his faith as he walked through his suffering and pain and loss. Together over these past weeks, we've attempted to capture both the honesty of this book as well as to acknowledge the depth of struggle we find within our own lives and experience, and the suffering we encounter in the world around us. It is a profound struggle. The quest to understand and to make sense of the suffering and pain that we encounter in our lives and in the world. It is a shared human experience and something we all encounter. Now, I'm not sure if you've been able to track along with us through our reading over these past 3 weeks, as we have attempted to capture together what we find and discover in the book of Job, but it has been a significant journey. Job is a part of a collection of 3 books known as the books of wisdom in the Bible. There's Proverbs, and then Ecclesiastes, and then the book of Job. And I think it's helpful to understand how these 3 books were actually included to work together. A journey through Proverbs explores this idea that God is wise and just, and how those who are good are rewarded and those who do evil face consequences or punishment, describing God's justice. And then in Ecclesiastes, it seems to basically dismantle much of this, saying we don't always get what we deserve. The world is fully unpredictable, and God is impossible to comprehend, like smoke that can't be captured. And it leads us into the book of Job, where we have watched this unfolding drama with the central question of how do we make sense of all this suffering that we find in the world? as we watch the stage of Job's life enact. The book of Job opens with this bizarre scenario, if we remember. God is approached by a bunch of these angelic creatures that were called the sons of God. They approached God, and we're told that with them was one that was called in Hebrew the Satan, which simply meant that he was the one who was opposed. And this is a character who emerges in the story as someone who was questioning how God was doing things on earth. And so God says to him, he says, take a look at my servant Job. This character, he is blameless. He's remarkable. He loves me and he is truly faithful to me. Here's a prime example of the potential of my people within my creation. But this opposing character makes the argument that Job is only a faithful follower. He only loves God because God has rewarded him so significantly. Job was full of blessing in his life. But the Satan says, if you remove those rewards, his love will disappear. And he insists that the love Job has for God is, in the end, self-serving. And so in the book of Job, this ensuing drama happens as God agrees to this experiment, and this opposer proceeds to bring absolute devastation into Job's life. Pain and suffering beyond our imagination, losing everything and everyone important to him. It was truly a painful read through the depth of suffering and the trauma that Job experiences. And we have watched this drama unfold. Everyone around Job and Job himself are desperately looking for an explanation of why this is happening. What's the reason that he is suffering so profoundly? And as we watch this quest ensue, we watch as Job pursues God for an answer in a place of gut level and relentless honesty. Uncomfortable honesty. In chapter 3, Job responds to this devastation. He says, may the day of my birth perish, and the night that said a boy is conceived, that day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. And out of this, the rest of the book of Job was a poetic discourse between Job and his friends. His friends trying to reason with Job in his pain, concluding that if God is indeed a just God, as they understood, that Job must have done something wrong to deserve all of this, and looking to help him fix it. But Job is adamantly convinced that he has done nothing to deserve this. It's not justice. It must just be arbitrary and without cause, because we watch this massive struggle that Job walks through. And at times, trying to grasp on to this idea that God is wise and just, but many other times just flat out accusing God of being reckless and corrupt. In the end, we have watched Job in a relentless and very honest pursuit of God, trying desperately to understand why this was happening to him. And it culminates when Job demands that God show up to explain himself. And so God does show up, but he shows up in the form of a fierce storm. And even as God shows up, he doesn't answer Job's question. Instead, we watch as he takes Job on this poetic tour of his expansive universe, displaying how profoundly complex and intricate it is, how unfathomable it is in its design, and how remarkable it is in the detail. He shows Job the grandeur of his creation and asks Job if he would even be capable of running it for a single moment. And he dives deep into the intricate details and says he knows his creation intimately. He sees the beauty in ways we can't even imagine and is keenly aware of everything that is happening in this vast and expansive creation. He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who kept the sea inside its boundaries and burst from the womb as I clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in a thick darkness? He says to Job, have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Have you made daylight spread to the ends of the earth? Can you direct the movement of the stars, binding the cluster of Pleiades or loosening the cords of Orion's belt? And in the end, we watch as Job responds to God. and has this pointed moment when he becomes keenly aware of his limited perspective and understanding. And Job shares these words: I know that you can do anything, and no one can stop you. You asked, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? And Job says, it is I. I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. I take back everything I said. I sit in the dust and ashes to show my repentance. The book of Job was his quest to understand his suffering. And as we understand the language in which the book of Job was written, it's very obviously meant to allude that Job is representing the greater human struggle that we all find ourselves in as we try to make sense of the suffering in the world and the struggle of our own experiences. And over these last 3 weeks, we've seen these characters in the story take different approaches to try and answer these difficult questions about why suffering is happening, why such pain, how do we resolve this? Job's 3 friends clearly concluded that suffering is punitive. It's consequential, that those who honor God and live to his expectations should be blessed, and that those that are suffering, it is a result of disobedience. It's retribution or punishment, and the suffering we see in our world must be a result of the mistakes and choices that people make, and they're getting what they deserve. Suffering is seen as a consequential outcome. But Job, on the other hand, seems to make the opposite case. He stands firm in his own innocence. He holds fast that he has been honorable in his life, and that suffering and pain that he finds himself in now is unjust. It is not fair. It clearly cannot be punitive because he has done nothing to deserve this. And he concludes that suffering is arbitrary. It must be because he himself doesn't deserve. So what other explanation could there be? And then this past week in our reading, another character emerged, Elihu, who joins the conversation. And what seems to be concluded from his perspective is that if we look hard enough, in our suffering we can discover something good. That our pain and suffering has a purpose, or that in some way our suffering is therapeutic or a catalyst for growth in our lives, and it has intention. And while all 3 of these perspectives may at times seem to hold elements of truth, all 3 of them fall glaringly short in answering the questions. And they leave gaping holes for us as we apply them into the real life suffering that we see around us. Each of them feel offensive as we attempt to understand the ways of God. And yet, we grasp on to explanations for the suffering that we see in the world around us and in the pain that we all experience. And in the end, after all the explanation and arguments fall short, and even after God shows up, the questions are never answered. It simply leaves Job in a place of humility, never learning why he suffered. Today, as we conclude our series on the book of Job, it's my hope that we can take the significance of what we have walked through together these past 3 weeks and to embrace what I think is the invitation of this book for all of us, to discover both honesty and humility, to hold on to an honesty in our faith and pursuit of God, an honesty that doesn't try and gloss over the suffering or pain that we experience with shallow answers that fall short, an honesty that can ask the difficult questions of God as we walk in relationship with him, and humility to recognize that we don't actually get to have all the answers. And what I think I've discovered in my own journey is that the deeper into the struggle we find ourselves, the less answers that we find make sense. And in humility, we recognize and we dismantle the arrogance it is to think that we can box God up into tidy packages that answer the questions for us. And to recognize our limitations within the vast grandeur of the God we serve as we simply discover a path to trusting God's goodness in the midst of our questions and our uncertainty. So as our time with Job comes to a close, this quest to answer the questions of our suffering, we aren't left with a nicely packaged conclusion, but rather the more courageous and the more difficult invitation to each of us to pursue God with both honesty and humility in the midst of the struggle. Well, I opened our time earlier by reading from a personal journal entry that was written in the honesty of a moment where we were feeling the weight of the struggle and pain after the loss of 2 lives to substance abuse. It was written from a difficult place, and we were struggling to resolve these questions for ourselves of the struggle that we were watching in the community around us. Why? These circumstances felt unfair and unjust. When it comes to suffering and to grief and to loss and to the broken experiences of our world, it is the common human experience to attempt to discover the why behind these experiences. And when these pains and sufferings are pushed even into those more severe spaces, those questions become increasingly more complex and difficult. The reality I would share is that for me and for the team I'm working with in our neighborhood supports, this past season has been one where this struggle to resolve these questions has at times felt unbearable, asking how much more. A young mom whose life has been filled with significant loss and trauma, and after recently finding success in her addiction recovery, was given the news that she only has a short time to live as cancer has overtaken her body, desperate to find some healing within the brokenness as she navigates what's ahead. A mom who's suffered unfathomable abuse at the hands of a violent partner, almost to the point of death, living in extreme fear, struggling to find stability for her family, and now needing to find the courage to face her abuser in court, wondering what the outcome will even be. A family desperately struggling through the cycle and impact of substance use, stemming from trauma as 3 young kids are hanging in the balance of care, whether their home will be safe enough for them to stay. A family facing eviction, not realizing that accessing CERB last year would actually impact their monthly supports, and now they don't have enough to meet both rent and living costs. A dear friend of our community who's been struggling through the advancing of dementia now loses her independence and deeply struggling to adapt. A friend and volunteer in our neighborhood who is weeping on our shoulders, literally, as her health is failing and she struggles with her body whittling away in palliative care. A family displaced from the tragedy of a house fire, losing much of what they owned without a place to call home. A young sister walking through the unfathomable grief of losing her brother to a recent homicide in our city. Church, these stories are just a few that we have encountered just within this past month. And these are just stories that represent a handful of people that we are connected with in our neighborhood, whose stories are multiplied 100 times over just outside these doors. And these are just the stories of one neighborhood within our city, multiplied exponentially as we move outwards into the world around us. We are overwhelmed by the depth of struggle and pain that we discover in the world around us. And to spend any legitimate time in the book of Job is to be intimately aware of the real struggle and pain we discover in the world around us, not to hide from it or ignore it or to turn our eyes away. What I think is unmistakable as we have journeyed through Job is that Job's honesty and raw and blunt emotion with God was a central theme to what this book was written to impart to us. What we see is that in the midst of his suffering and pain, Job chose not to turn from God, but rather to pursue him with an intense and even uncomfortable honesty that asked real questions and wasn't afraid of acknowledging his own uncertainty or confusion. I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up and you merely stare back at me. God will not let me get my breath, but he fills me with bitterness. Does it please you, God, to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the plans of the wicked? God, where are you? Are you silent? Are you incapable? Job's prayer style isn't exactly what you would expect to hear at church on a Sunday morning. His complaints are raw and honest, and he bitterly lashes out at God. They are unfiltered, and they come from a place of genuine struggle. But I think that the reality is that our approach to prayer and our interaction with God is a little bit too sanitized. Well, quite honestly, way too sanitized. God says it was in Job's honesty that he discovered what a real relationship with him was. God says in Job 42 to all of the others, "You haven't been honest either with me or about me, not the way my friend Job has." Our faith is not stronger when we prop it up with thinly veiled sentiments. It is stronger in honesty. This was my experience this past week as I encountered a compelling faith sitting with the broken young mother who just has a short time left to live. Sitting in the honesty of this confusion and wrestling with the most honest of all questions. Why? Why now? This is the more compelling and real faith than in the padded answers that deny the underlying honesty as we run from our fears and uncertainty. If you think you have a grasp on how God works, I wonder if you are too distant from the struggles of our world. If we think the answers are all clear, I wonder if we are simply just disconnected from suffering. When we encounter suffering, we so desperately want to find the why. And honestly, I think we often routinely apply one or more of these attempted answers or explanations that we find in Job. But the truth is, the longer I live, the more I see the complexities of suffering, and the more any of these explanations break down, the closer you get to the struggle. When a child grows up in an unsafe house, knowing nothing but abuse and rejection, and then they emerge into adulthood and begin to make destructive decisions and experience immense pain and suffering as a result, is their suffering punitive to the choices that they've made? Because they really didn't stand much of a chance. Is it arbitrary and random? Because how do I resolve this idea that they simply didn't win the loving family lottery that I did? Or is this suffering meant to teach them something? Because that feels more offensive to me than I can stomach. And what if that household being unsafe and abusive was actually an outcome of somebody else's harm to them that you could trace back generations? Or what about when we see poverty that leads to bad health outcomes and people suffer because of it? And that poverty itself can actually be traced to a systemic oppression of our very own wealth and comfort that we equate to God's blessing. Are these sufferings punitive? Are they just arbitrary? Are they a lesson? The true honesty of Job comes for me when we have to look at the worst pain and suffering and brokenness in the eye, when it is personal and when it is sitting across the room from you or in the neighborhood outside these doors. And we have to look at God and say, God, this makes no sense. Why? I don't get it. Are you incapable? Are you silent? Would you show yourself? And it is in this place that God invites us on the same journey he took Job on. In his pain, in his confusion and uncertainty, in his suffering and his grief or his loss, God welcomed Job's honesty, and he leads him to a place of humility and concludes that it is not in discovering the answers to our questions that we find our peace, but that it is in the humble and honest pursuit of a relationship with our Creator where we can find rest in the one who holds all of these complexities within his hands. In this recent season of feeling the almost smothering weight of the struggle that we've been invited to in the neighborhood around us, there's a really meaningful song that I have revisited many times on my playlist called Hard Rain by Joshua Hislop. In it, there is a lyric that I find quite helpful, one that maybe helps to restrain me from migrating over into any savior complex with the needs that I encounter, but also one that avoids being crushed by the weight of the things that we experience. And it just says this: now a hard rain's falling down, and every drop calls out, I'm just a part of something else right where I belong. There's a freedom that comes for me in recognizing that God has placed me where I am in the circle of these needs and struggles and brokenness, and in my own struggles and brokenness. And I must not run or not be present within them, but to recognize that I am but a small part in an expansive space with complexities that I will never understand. And that I don't own the weight of the world, and I don't own the weight of even of these outcomes or these situations. I am both a significant part of where God has placed me and a remarkably insignificant part of the vast grandeur of this world in which God holds his creation within his care. And I think that this is the invitation to humility that we find in the book of Job. In the hard rains that fall and every drop that calls out that we're just a part of something else, right where we belong. At the end of the day, Job is about honesty and humility to me. It is about acknowledging that God doesn't fit into any of the boxes that we build for him, that we live with a limited viewpoint. And we must recognize that in the way that we interact with each other, extending kindness and grace to what others are walking through rather than imposing our explanations or our conclusions about why they are experiencing. And ultimately, that we are being asked to step into dependence and trust in a God whom we cannot fathom or understand or comprehend. And in humility, relinquishing our arrogance of thinking that we do. And to instead discover ourselves in a place of worship to our Creator, letting God be God and stop trying to take his role. In the song I quoted earlier, there's another line that I have grasped onto, and it says this: "And so uncertainty is just humility. When you face the vast infinity, who could know at all?" A posture of humility, relinquishing the control of a neatly fitted God into our box, is actually the more difficult and courageous road. It's not a posture of inaction or apathy or indifference. In fact, understanding our limited place, leaving room for our limited comprehension, gives us the freedom to be fully present both in our own struggles and within the struggles of others. And it allows us to pursue God with a humble and honest faith. As a close to our journey through Job, I've asked if Ben could take us through these lyrics of this song together. A song that continues to mean a lot to me as we carry forward within the struggles around us.
There must be more to this, some way of finding it. But if all we know is all there is, that would be enough. Now a hard rain's falling down, every drop calls out. I am just a part of something else, right where I belong, right where I belong. Oh, da 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 da, right where I belong. If the questions stay the same, how could the answers change? For what quickly burns, quickly fades, leaves you in the dark. And so uncertainty is just humility when you face the vast